All right, welcome everyone. I appreciate you all being here and attending class today. So this is going to be a little bit different for everybody, I'm sure. I know that you've probably taken online classes, but not a synchronous online class where we're providing lectures at the normal time and you just attend. So it's going to be a little bit different. Hang in there. We don't know how long we're going to have to do this, but we'll march through it. So just a couple of things. Make sure that you're aware when you're in here. Go ahead and make sure that you're muted. I've muted everybody already so that we're ready to go. I'll take attendance based on just who I see in the list here, and then keep your eye on your chat function at the bottom of your screen. If a number pops up there, you can actually click on it now, and it will pull your chat window off to the side, and you can kind of monitor that for questions or comments as we go along. And post your questions there for me, and I'll just I'll respond in the lecture or respond directly to you. If it's a question you only want to ask me, then make sure you use the drop down and select me on that. So I want to make sure that everybody can see. You should right now see the slides, and you should see me off to the right in the lecture. Can somebody just give me a chat that that's what they see? Okay. All right. Thank you, Luis and Miriam. I appreciate that. All right. So today we're going to talk about in this week before spring break, we're going to talk about the topic of leadership. And we're going to look at that. We're going to meander a little bit into the slides and away from the slides, and just kind of discuss leadership as a topic on its own. Some of the experiences that you see, and it's going to be even more difficult. I know that you are not a talkative group, but when we get into the discussion and we start talking about this, I'd appreciate it if you would unmute and start sharing your video so that you can ask your question or give a response to some situation that you've seen. Now, when we think about leadership, we're going to talk about these learning objectives here. We're going to talk about the conclusions of trait theories. As with everything, when we talk about human behavior, there's always a theory about it. We're going to look at the central tenets and main limitations of behavioral theories. We're going to talk about and contrast contingency theories of leadership, and then describe the contemporary theories or more modern theories of leadership and how we use that. We're going to look at roles of leaders, positive impact, how they can have a positive impact, and challenges that we may incur in our leadership role. All right. So what are we talking about when we talk about leadership? What does leadership really mean? So from a definitive standpoint, we're really just looking about the ability to influence a group toward the achievement of a vision or set of goals. And notice that in my weekly video, one of the things we talked about in a definition of leadership is that it's not just getting things accomplished. A manager can do that. A supervisor can do that. I can direct you as your manager or leader, supervisor, to do what I need you to do. But it doesn't mean that you're going to become invested in it, that you believe in it, that you'll follow it based on your own skills and abilities and freedoms. What we have to do as leaders is we have to influence people to accomplish these things. Effective leaders will wind up influencing people based on the end goal desire, what we need to do. And then the people will then go and do those steps that normally a manager or a supervisor would direct them to do, they wind up doing those on their own to achieve those final goals. So we're going to look at this as an influential aspect and not strictly a managerial or supervision aspect. Now, I asked the question in my weekly video, are all leaders managers, good managers, and are all managers good leaders? Well, the answer is absolutely not. Neither one is true. I'm sure you've worked for some people as your supervisor or manager that were horrible leaders. They were more directive in nature. They really didn't care or think about the influence aspect and how people, as we've talked multiple times in this course, how people feel about something. And that's kind of the crux of everything we're talking about in this course of human behavior and leadership. We're now in week 9. We're starting to bring the leadership aspect in, but the previous 8 weeks, we've talked really about how people feel, how they feel about themselves, how they feel about their job, how they feel about the people around them, and how those feelings drive what they do. So we've seen this direct correlation of people's feelings, their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, their moods, all those things coming together and impacting how they perform, what they do, where they go, when they do it, how well they do it. So now we're looking at, from a leadership aspect, how do we start to bring that about where we start to influence those moods, emotions, values, thought processes towards a common goal, a common vision, where we want to be in the future. So certainly not all leaders are good managers, and not all managers are good leaders. So that direction or that discussion I just had was focused really on the lack of leadership ability in management. But the opposite is true as well. We also have a lot of leaders who don't have the skills to be effective managers. And we often refer to them as thought people, the idea people, the motivators, the ones that get people fired up about something. But when it comes to actually executing that, doing the work, organizing, managing, scheduling, coordinating people, those types of things, they may not have those skills. So they become the voice of the organization and the cheerleader and the person that gets people engaged and influenced and excited about something. But then they have people surrounding them to manage and coordinate and supervise in the execution of their vision. And we see that a lot of times in large scale companies where we have a leader of the organization who can drive the thought and the emotional process of people. But then we have other people who are the coordinators of that execution. So we've talked now about leadership in general, and we're really talking about the kind of structured leadership, who's in charge. But what else do we have? We have the unofficial or the non-sanctioned leader. And a lot of times those are just as important or more important than the formal leader of an organization. So I often ask the question, have you ever been in an area where, or in a work environment where the leader or manager or somebody says, this is what we're going to do. This is our idea. This is how we're going to do this. And people in the organization or around the group will turn to somebody else in the group and say, well, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this? So you know automatically that that person is an unofficial or a non-sanctioned leader in that organization. They have the power and the influence over others. It's been given to them. So that's one of the things that we'll talk about in terms of leadership. Leadership ability is something that people have, but it must be recognized by others in order to be effective. So I can believe that I have outstanding leadership abilities, but it doesn't mean that others are going to follow me as a leader unless they recognize that I have those skills and abilities. So when we think about a leader, we're going to talk about these traits. And what do we think about in terms of traits? What are they? What do people think about? What do you think about when you think about a leader, somebody that you look up to and you want to follow? So if you could just pop in the chat, spit out whatever comes to your mind in terms of outstanding leadership abilities. What kind of traits do people have? And I'll look for a couple as we're going here. And we're going to talk about trait theory and how people believe that certain traits beget good leadership. So we hear Mackenzie says outstanding leaders should be well-spoken and knowledgeable in the subject. Okay, great. So if well-spoken, we can certainly talk about that. We know that people have to be able to articulate the idea, the vision, the goals of the organization. But do they also need to be knowledgeable in the subject from a technical perspective? I would suggest that they certainly need to be knowledgeable and be able to speak to the issues, but to a certain degree. If you have an effective leader, now, and I'll give you an example. Oftentimes, we have leaders who move from industry to industry. You will have somebody who may have been in the automobile industry, and then they move somewhere else into a completely different industry. So they have the ability to gather people together, to influence them, to motivate them, and get them moving towards a common goal once they understand what that goal is. But can they go from one industry and they're very familiar with automotive, and let's say they go into the pharmaceutical industry or the healthcare or in restaurants. They don't necessarily have the technical skills to do that, but a good leader and a manager can understand goals and objectives and how important the steps are to get there, and then surround themselves with the people who have the ability to execute that and make it happen, and advise them as they're moving along on what the key attributes are. And Miriam talked about effective listeners. We talked about communication last week. So we know that listening is probably the key component in communications. And we have to be able to listen and understand and use that to identify what the key issues are and how they impact our movement towards those goals and objectives. So good comments there, and you're absolutely right. You're spot on those. So as we move along and we start thinking about leadership traits, we could talk about the trait theories. And as I said, everybody has this, when we do a textbook or we do an academic exercise, we're always talking about theories and how they impact people. And a lot of times people will look to identify these traits in individuals and select them out. So if you're in a group, again, we talk about these group environments. If you're in a group and all of a sudden I ask you, as I have in the past, to select a leader in your group, we did that last week or the week before when we were talking about a couple of things. No, we did it when we were reviewing for the midterm. I asked you when we divided into two groups to pick a leader. And immediately, I can guarantee you immediately that most of you were already thinking about who had been more vocal in the class, how had they articulated their ideas, how shy or outgoing were they. So you're looking at these traits, a couple that we've already talked about from a communication perspective and the ability to speak and articulate. You automatically identified those traits. And we can think about them in terms of how extroverted are you, extroversion, somebody that is outgoing and willing to get in front of everybody. and express their ideas and express the goals and objectives of the organization. And we often refer to them in terms of being the cheerleader for the organization. That gets people fired up and gets them moving in the right direction. And then we talk about things like conscientiousness and openness to experience, strong relationships of leaderships. But this conscientiousness really goes to how are we using this information and our influence in the right manner for the right purpose to get to the right goal in the right way. So those are important things, and we can start to think about it in terms of, we certainly have leaders who had their goals and objectives, but had immoral or nefarious goals and objectives that they were trying to reach. Obviously, when we think about history, you can think about Adolf Hitler, very outgoing, extroverted, very influential, able to get people moving in the right direction, but not for the right reasons. So from a leadership perspective, as we're looking at this, we want to make sure that we identify those and that we look at them from a perspective of how conscientious and how focused are they on achieving the right things for the organization as we move forward. Now, as we look at this, we can start to determine, what do we really mean? So if you think about the leaders around you, we're talking about leaders who can express themselves and be outgoing and assertive. We're looking at them being disciplined and able to keep commitments they make and move toward the common goal. And then that they have an apparent advantage when it comes to leadership. Well, what do we mean by that? I mean, why would we think about an apparent advantage, and how dangerous is that the theorists throw that in here to say somebody has an apparent advantage? Well, if we think back to our week 2 discussion on diversity, we could all automatically take this last one that they have and go to a bad place in business and leadership and management and say, well, this person has money, or this person is a white male, or something like that, that they automatically have an apparent advantage. So I'm one that tends to shy away from the apparent advantage. And I like to rephrase this and really talk about, what is the person's propensity to be a leader? What are their skill sets? What's their experience? What's their energy like? What are they talking about, and how do they talk to people? And how have they demonstrated in the past that they're ready to undertake this? So now, one of the things that we can talk about, so as we start to think about this and we start to think about the human relation aspect, human behavior, and how that relates to their leadership abilities, we can think about their emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence, empathy, the ability to understand how what they do, what they say, how they act, the decisions they make are going to impact other people. So effective leaders have to have that ability to just look forward and essentially put themselves in the shoes of the people that they're in charge of, that they're trying to lead, and understand how these things are going to impact them as they move along in their career and as they make those decisions. All right. So when we look at these things, we're going to talk about 2 conclusions. Traits can predict leadership, but they predict the emergence of a leadership, as opposed to understanding the difference between effective and ineffective leaders. So just because somebody has good leadership traits doesn't mean that they're going to be a good leader, because now we've got to transition from the ability to do something to actually doing it, right? The ability to execution. the ability to making decisions that follow these trait aspects that we've discussed, and understanding how those impact the people around them. So now let's talk about behavior. So we've kind of outlined what a leader looks like, what traits they need to have, and how they might use those. But let's think about the behavior of a leader. And we can start to think now, are we going to talk about, as leaders, are we only going to focus on leaders that have the ability and give them that role? Or are we also going to train leadership abilities? So it's kind of like when we were talking before about, are people born with certain attributes, or are they learned attributes? And from a leadership perspective, we can certainly say that there are inherent leaders, and we have the ability, and they may use that correctly, but we can also develop leadership skills. If we couldn't develop leadership skills, then there wouldn't be all of these schools around the nation based on leadership and training and developing leaders as we go along. And in fact, we wouldn't spend a lot of time and effort on mentoring programs, because mentoring programs are really about developing leadership and bringing leaders into the world, and having them use their newfound capability to drive an organization towards its goals and objectives. All right, so when we look at this and we think about initiating structure, we're talking about, are they organized? Can they do these management type things that we're talking about, and create ideas and organize them so that they're understandable and executable by the people that are following them? And then the other aspect that we have to think about in leadership is, how likable are they? We may have someone who has an outstanding leadership capability, and they're very organized, they can execute this, they have an excellent plan, but we just don't like them. And if you don't like them, then nobody's going to follow them. Nobody's going to pay attention to what they're saying. Nobody's going to move about their day trying to accomplish the goals and objectives of the organization based on what this person says. All right, so we have to think about those two things, organized and likability, when we look at it. Now, when we think about leadership too, we have to look at their behavioral theories, and we think about culturally appropriateness. Is it someone who can operate in this multicultural day and age that we have today, this global environment? And how do they interact with people of all ages, sexes, religions, nationalities? So we have to have someone who can provide not only a vision and a mission and a goal of an organization, but that can relay and impart that information and that energy, excitement toward that goal to everybody that they encounter, everybody in the organization. All right. So when we think about these models, we've got the Fiedler contingency model. When we talk about group performance, obviously that has to do with leadership and the ability to move the group in one way. But there's this notion of the least preferred coworker questionnaire. So what are we really thinking about in terms of when we look at the group and how the group is going to execute? And when I say execute, we're really talking about doing the task or mission or work of the group. So we have to think about, in that environment, how are people interacting? How are they understanding each other? What's their relationship? And how are we as leaders going to get all of them, regardless of their status in the group, regardless of their likes and dislikes, and how they will move ahead? All right, so situational leadership theory just goes to the fact that not all leadership styles are appropriate at the same time or in all scenarios. We're seeing an example of that today. So, and I can use an example of a military context since I have a little bit of a military background. When you're in peacetime, there are certain leadership styles. We're developing, we're training, we're building people up. Once you get into a wartime scenario and actually into maybe a war environment, a battlefield, those leadership scenarios change. The style changes. How people will interact changes. And today, as we deal with this COVID-19 crisis, you see on the news, you see different governors, you see the president, you see industry talking about things, and they're shifting their leadership style, being more directive. There's a sense of urgency. It's no longer just identifying a goal and letting and nurturing people and moving them toward it. It's about identifying a goal and mandating certain criteria, certain movements, certain processes, certain outcomes in order to get there. So the sense of urgency is ramped up. Things change. We see the leadership style change. And you've heard me talk about leadership and management is about getting the right people in the right place at the right time with the right training, the right skill sets, the right resources, and allowing them to do their job. That is, in essence, situational leadership, because the right place at the right time always talks about what is going on today, what is occurring, what do I need to respond to. So we'll look at those as we go through from a situational perspective. Now we can go from point A to point B, a path goal theory. I want, here's where we are today. Here's where I want to be tomorrow. And that's really kind of a deficit model when we talk about it. What do we look like today? What do we want to look like tomorrow? Where are we today? What are our goals for tomorrow? And what's the delta between those two scenarios? And then that becomes my problem set that I have to solve. And I can create a methodical process, intermediate goals and objectives to systematically march from point A to point B as we look through this. All right, so when we start thinking about leadership, we have to adjust to the task. If you look at this, that's out of your textbook, when we think about people developing skills, look at the things that we see here: conferences, reading materials, listening to a mentor, and obtaining employee feedback. So the obtaining employee feedback is one of the most critical, because that's where you get true reflection of whether or not you're doing things right or you're doing things wrong in the eyes of the people that you're trying to lead. Now, does it mean that the employee feedback is always right and it's spot on? No, because as we've seen in these first 8 weeks, we're talking about people. We're dealing with their emotions, their backgrounds, their upbringing, their own biases and prejudices, and how they react and interact with individuals. So we have to take that into account. But it is important to understand from a holistic perspective what the group thinks. Are they buying into what you're selling, the goals and objectives? Are we moving along there? So we have this personal relationship, or this personal compatibility that we talk about with individuals in the organization, not just with groups, but with the individual themselves. And we talked about this notion of in-group and out-group. And you see this leadership relationship must be able to interact with all of them, everybody in the organization. From a leader perspective, there really shouldn't be an out-group. We should be trying to define what is best for the group as a whole and the organization, right? Now, key characteristics of charismatic leadership. And what do we mean by charismatic leadership? We're talking about somebody that is driven and people follow from an emotional perspective. that we can get behind. So somebody that rallies people and we're just ready to go and we follow them, we like them, and in some cases it goes way too far. You know, you could think of the Jonestown massacre, where all those people were killed drinking the Kool-Aid, as it was, that was poisoned. But from a charismatic leadership perspective, that's a good thing, that we can have this ability as long as we stay focused and conscientious on what the goals are and making those positive goals. We certainly want people to be energetic and emotional about their support for our organization and our goals and objectives. We see that today in the presidential race, specifically in the Democratic primary. Bernie Sanders has a very energetic base that follows him and view him as a charismatic leader. You see that of all other candidates as well. The base, or the people that follow them, view that person as a charismatic leader, and they follow them regardless of what their goals and objectives may be. They're following the person because how much they like and believe in that person. Excuse me. All right. So if we think about the characteristics of this, we can look at vision and articulation, that they have something that people believe in, an idealized goal, personal risk. They're willing to be the face of a goal and objective. And if that goal and objective turns out to be wrong, then that comes at great personal sacrifice for them. We have to have this sensitivity to the follower needs, that we understand who they are and what they need and what they want, and we respond directly or feed off of that input we get back from the group. And lastly, we have to have this unconventional behavior. We have to be someone that is outside the norm, somebody that thinks differently. You know, if you think about Apple products and Steve Jobs and the things he was thinking about, if you think 15 years ago about picking up your phone and being able to have every single thing in your life, whether it's talking to people, whether it's your calendar, whether it's your banking, whether it's, you know, doing schoolwork on your phone, and having that as a vision, people would have thought you're crazy. But in the end, that's a vision that people got behind, and got behind a charismatic leader and marched toward that goal. All right. So let me ask you a question. Are charismatic leaders born or made? What do you think? So, right, Josh says, could they be both? Exactly. So let me go back to a question. So Miriam wanted, are there people who refuse to be led by any type of leader? Is there any way to lead those people? So that's a great question. We may have people who are loners, who don't believe in following somebody else. But in essence, are they people that considers themselves the leader? And when they're not in that position, they refuse to accept a position that doesn't conform to that. So certainly we may have people that way, but one of the key things to understand is we have to talk about those people in terms of what's important to them. And a leader who has those people has to get to that point. You know, what are we thinking about in terms of that person? What's important to them? What do they need? And how does my vision satisfy that need? So if it doesn't satisfy that need, then they're obviously in the out group, and they're obviously more difficult to bring along. And those are some of the key challenges that we'll face in those scenarios. So when we talk about leadership or charismatic leaders being born or made, and Josh says, can they be both? Absolutely, they can be both. We have people who are born charismatic traits. But you can go, think about your own schooling. You probably took a speech class or a communications class and had to give an oral presentation, and you may not have been very good at it in the beginning. But as time goes by and you learn what the key elements are of communicating and how you engage people and how you look them in the eye and how you organize your thoughts and how you get them to where they are of interest to your audience and how you translate that to their needs and how your ideas are going to satisfy their needs, your skill set becomes better and better and better over time. And as you become better over time, you gain this confidence. And once you gain this confidence, then you can start to develop this aura of charisma. Because charismatic leaders, that's the one thing that they have probably more so than anything else, is a level of confidence that they believe what they are doing, what they are selling, what they are trying to get people to do, and the goals and objectives they're trying to get people to follow passionately are the best thing for those people. So now they automatically become, through this confidence, they become more charismatic in the way they present it. So we have this notion of being passionate about your work, your idea, and the promotion of that, and then that passion turning into enthusiasm from the leadership or the led groups as we move through there. So how do we relay passion? Do we relay passion this way? No. The first thing we do is how we talk to people, how we interact. So I go back to my example of the presidential race and the Democratic primaries right now. So think about when you've seen, and I don't know how many of you are Bernie Sanders followers or Joe Biden or any other candidate, but think about when you see Bernie Sanders speak, are these the things that you see when you see him speak? Animated voice, reinforced with eye contact, facial expressions, gestures for emphasis. So these are all things that show somebody is passionate about what they're talking about. And we see that in conversations. And it was funny, I lived in Italy for 5 years. And my mother and father came over, and one of the observations my mother had was, why is it that the Italians are always arguing with each other? And she made this observation because they're always close, they're always speaking loudly, they're always using hand gestures and pointing, and it seems like they're screaming at each other, but they're just passionate about what they're talking about. And it's not that they're mad, they're just exuding passion in their topic as they talk to one another. And you see that in businesses. You see that when effective leaders and charismatic leaders get out in front of people and they start talking about the goals and objectives, they get fired up. Think of Tony Robbins and how he gets out and speaks to crowds. He's just, by the time he talks for 3 hours, it's like running a marathon. And he's just so exhausted because he puts so much into how he talks to people. And Miriam's right. People are really inspired by the energy you give off and how enthused you are. So we could talk about that from a charismatic perspective in the leader. And then we know that the followers actually tap into that. They think about that. They engage in that. And it becomes infectious in the organization as we move through. Now, excuse me again. So when we think about charismatic leaders and we think about their followers now, how do they influence the followers? What do they think about? Well, the first thing is you have to have something that I'm interested in. You have to have an appealing vision, something that I can say, oh, okay, well, that makes sense to me. I can certainly do that. I can see myself being engaged in that. I can see myself being involved, or I can see that that is something that would benefit me in the long run. And then we articulate that by turning that into a vision statement. A vision statement really of describing a future scenario, one that people can believe in, that they can put themselves in that circumstance, and understanding that. And then we talked about values and norms as we move along. So we've got to think about establishing a new set of values. Because if we don't change the values of the organization to conform to where we want to be in the future, then nothing is going to change. We're going to have the same status quo. We're just going to move along, and we're not going to get to that new vision that we were talking about, that we're evolving people over time. So we have to have that new set of values that people are going to conform to and believe in and operate by. And then when we have this vision, we have to have this courage and conviction about the vision. We have to live it. It has to be at the forefront of all of our discussions, all of our engagement, all of our directions that we may put out, our goals and objectives. We have to be convicted about and have the courage to stand by what we've laid out as the vision for the organization. And a lot of organizational leaders will use this in terms of every time they speak, they will weave components of that vision and new values in the vision statement into their speeches. Every time they talk to people, they may talk about the tenets of their new vision and have key elements that people can live by and refer to on a day-to-day basis. And then as you develop things in the organization, you can tie the outcome or the process to one of those key tenets in the vision and show that what we're doing is directly supporting our goals for the organization. All right. So when we talk about charismatic leadership, is that situationally driven as well? Do we need to change how we drive people and how we get enthusiasm in the organization and the people that we're leading? Does that change depending on the circumstances? You bet it does. I mean, we'll see things that are different and see people who may be steady state as they're going along and not as charismatic. But especially if you're looking for things that need immediate change, you're responding to a crisis, something urgent, then you've got to get out there and be the cheerleader and fire people up and get them engaged and moving towards that new goal or that urgent intermediate goal when we look at this. Now, when we think about this in terms of personal behavior, you have this narcissism, somebody that's self-involved. A lot of times that is involved in describing a charismatic leader, but that's more of a negative connotation because we want leadership and we want to develop leadership that talks about the common good for the organization, for everybody that's involved in the organization. And if we have a narcissist leader who is more involved in satisfying their own needs through this charismatic leadership, then that's a negative example of the organization. Now, let's look at two different terms. Let's look at term of transactional leadership versus transformational leaders. And when we think about those, what are the differences between the two? So if we can actually get to that when we start to look at just the definition of the name or what's involved in the name. Transactional leadership, transaction. I'm doing something in exchange for this, or I do something and something else happens. So we know if you go to the store and you set your bread and your milk down on the counter, and you give them your credit card, and they run the money and they run the credit card, and it clears, and then they give you your items that you paid for. That is a transaction. I've done something. I have an expectation that this is exactly what's going to occur. But if we look on the other hand at transformational leadership, we're really talking about free thought and the ability for people to move on towards a common goal, but get there in such a way that they have some control over it. So when we think about these idealized influences, we're really talking about here's where we want to be in the future. And we're going to inspire people, and we're going to allow them to think, and we're going to stimulate their thought and get them to looking at the future and coming up with ways where they can be involved in getting there, in achieving the outcome. So transactional, transformational, which ones do you think would be better for the organization? What do we think? As I take a drink. All right, so I see it depends on the situation. I see transformational. So it does depend on the situation. We can go back to talking about that urgency, but in general, I would suggest that you really want more transformational, because you want people to be involved. And remember, we've talked about this several times, is that when we get people involved in the thought process, in the decision-making process, in the process, in developing the processes for the organization and the outcomes, and get them involved in establishing the goals for the organization, then they begin to take ownership. And they start to understand that, and it becomes theirs. So now we can look at this leadership model, and we start thinking about down here, more passive and ineffective are transactional components, where we have a laissez-faire leader who's just kind of hands off, and things are what they are, and you know the process, and you need to do that. Management, contingent and reward. But we get into the active component and transformational leadership styles. We increase the effectiveness, and we're more actively engaged in that, and the employees are more actively engaged in that. So it doesn't mean that this down here, the more passive transactional leadership styles don't have their place. They do. But for an organization to grow and evolve over time, you need to make sure that we're looking at transformational leadership and how it impacts the organization. So how does that work? Creativity, both the leader and the people in the organization. Decentralizing authority and responsibility, pushing it down, giving people more authority in decision making. So people are more willing to take risk. Go back to the example that I gave you several weeks ago about my budget analyst. And remember, I had a budget of roughly $170 million a year. So every time we went to move money from one line of accounting to another, they had to come and get leaders, or supervisors had to come and get approval to do that. And when you're talking about $170 million, you can well imagine that there were a lot of transactions where we were moving money from one project to another. So it got to the point where it was excessive, and I told the budget analyst, you know the goals and objectives of the organization. Don't ask me if it's anything less than $50,000. Make the decision. So I was empowering that budget analyst to make those decisions and decentralizing the decision-making process. I was pushing it down and allowing her to make those decisions. And then also allowing her to take risk. Did she always make the right decision? No. But we talked about it when she didn't. And then the next time she knew. So it became a learning process with a limit on the risk. If we're talking about up to $50,000 in a $170 million budget, that's just a small percentage point. So she was able to work in that environment, make decisions, and then grow her ability to make better decisions in the future. And then when we think about compensation in this type of scenario is the more in an organization that we push down the ability to make decisions and the responsibility, we also have to think about how are we compensating those employees? How are we allowing them to do their job, but also fairly recognizing what that job is worth in the organization? And then we have to make sure that we keep track of that and we do it fairly and effectively. So what is a good transformational leader? You know, we start to think about these things, you know, transformational leaders supported at diverse job levels, occupations, isn't effective in all situations, greater impact on the bottom line in smaller privately held firms than in more complex organizations. So transformational leadership has a greater impact on the bottom line in smaller organizations, privately held firms, over more complex organizations. So why would that be? Why would we think that transformational leadership is more impactful in those smaller group settings, smaller organizations? Well, obviously the answer is you're in more direct contact. So if you have an organization of 5,000 people that's very vertical in nature, and there are 5 levels between you and the average worker, you may get information to the average worker, but does it, as it comes down the chain of command in the organization from the owner and president to vice presidents to division chairs to branch chairs down to the team lead and then the individual employee, how much of that enthusiasm that you had in the way you imparted that information is carried all the way through to the average employee? Certainly you can have in some cases where you'll have direct conversation or direct interaction through a video conference or an all-company meeting, but that day-to-day reinforcement of that goal and objectives occurs more at the level where there's direct interaction. So we have to think about that in an organization, and how do we impart that transactional component, that enthusiasm to all employees all the way down through the organization. All right, transformational leadership more strongly correlated with a variety in workplace outcomes. So we can understand that just by understanding that when we do transformational leadership, we're allowing people to think and decide, make decisions based on their own experiences and their own thought process. So we can see that we're going to have wider variation in what the outcomes are and what people do. All right, transformational versus charismatic. Now, I would suggest that there is some level of charisma involved in being transformational. You have to get people engaged and get them believing in a different vision for the future. So when we transform, we're going to go from current state to some future state. And we have to convince people and get them involved in that, get them to believe in that. But we can have transformation without being as charismatic, as outgoing, as passionate about it. And we can be slow and methodical in our transformation over time. when we're talking about charismatic leaders, they often look at more about what they're saying, how they're communicating, how they're influencing people. But in the end, you both have to inspire people. You have to inspire them to go from point A to point B and to be able to accept this completely different state that we're talking about. Completely different from the status quo. Maybe completely different from a comfortable setting that we have to a future setting that contains unknowns, that people may be a little bit uncomfortable with, but they believe in the leader's ability to get them there. They believe that the leader will provide the right resources, the right training, set up the right scenarios, and the right environment to promote success in the end. All right, so we talk about faith, we talk about believing in that, but now we go back to, for instance, my example of, I said Adolf Hitler as a charismatic leader. We could talk about John F. Kennedy. We could talk about Dr. Martin Luther King. You know, all charismatic leaders who were very emotional and very outgoing in what they believe and how they impart it to people. But we have to think about this in the context of ethics and being able to do the right thing at the right time for the right reason and drive people in this. So when we start to think about this notion of socialized charismatic leadership, we're really talking about what the other people need, what the common good is for the organization, and not our own benefit. How are we pushing forward the organization, the goals and objectives, the criteria, the decisions we make? How are we pushing those forward with this emotional intelligence that we talked about earlier in understanding what the impact is going to be on everybody that's involved and making the ethical decision that is right for the organization and not just for one small group or yourself as an individual. And then when we start to think about this and we start to look at what's good, the greater good for everybody else, then we have this term called servant leadership. And we start thinking about how can I best use my skills and abilities to provide for the greater good for other people, other organizations, other people as individuals or groups, and how I can use that and my emotional intelligence and my skills about listening, empathizing, persuading, stewardship, and developing people to move towards this common goal and satisfy the greater good for people. All right. So what is the key component for effective leadership? We're really talking about trust. We're really talking about the followers having trust that they believe in the person who is leading them. They believe that that person has their best interest at heart. They believe and give up their own freedoms or create this vulnerability that they're putting their future and sometimes their life in somebody else's hands. Think about if we completely evolve a company and we're going to take it away from something that we've historically done, that we've been very good at, but the leadership sees on the horizon a need to change, that industry maybe is going to change over time. And we say we're going to stop doing this and we're going to start doing something completely different. That makes people nervous. It makes people very nervous. So they have to have this trust that the leader has their best interest at heart. And so trust is a key component associated with leadership. Now, I had a leader before, a general who I worked for, who said he had his 10 tenets that he believed in, his basic ground rules that everybody was to follow. And he would always talk about trust as one of them. And his thought process was, he said, trust is very important to me. And if I lose trust in you, it is nearly impossible to get it back. So think about that in terms of your leadership skills and how you lead a company or even your small group. If the first time you fail at the trust aspect and the group loses trust in you, it's very difficult to get that back, because their general position is going to be, well, why should we trust you when we did that before and you failed us? And you can use it, well, this time's going to be different. And you can see how that can be very difficult to overcome. So we're really talking about this psychological contract that you have between individuals or groups and you as a leader, that you have their best interest at heart. And so that's one that leaders must maintain and hold dear as one of the key elements of their leadership ability, and look never to violate that element of trust. So it goes back to when we talked last week about communication and starting to look at things like rumor mill and other things. And we say, if there's something you don't know, say what you don't know. Don't make something up. Don't cover it up. Don't hide it. Just say, I don't know. And that goes a long way when you take that tack. That goes a long way to protecting that trust environment that you have with people. All right. So when we look at this diagram, the nature of trust, when we look at a leadership, we're talking about integrity, benevolence, and ability, and their ability to trust. And when we think about the other people, how willing are they to take a risk? Is there information sharing? Do they understand that? How effective are they? And how productive are they? So all of these things are dependent on an organization and its employees' ability to trust what the leader is trying to get them to do. All right, so when we think about success and failure in an organization, we can look at things, leadership styles, how we're employing leadership skills, different people with different leadership abilities. Are they in the right place at the right time with the right skills, with the right ability, the right resources to enable success? So when we look at failures and we think about failures, we're really now talking about this notion of the attribution theory, where we always look to attribute something to somebody or something that occurred, and how that decision was made. And you can refer to this attribution theory as the blame game. What happened and why and who is responsible for it. So, and people are automatically, as human nature, they're automatically going to do that. All right. So in an organization, how do we plan for leadership? How do we plan for new leaders? How do we select somebody to lead the organization going forward? So we have to identify what's critical for the organization. Are we in a position where we're going to be evolving? Are we in a position where people may not trust the old leadership? So are we in a position where we're going to be changing and it creates a lot of uneasiness, unnerve? People are unsure about the future. So we think about all these things that may occur, and that would drive us to think about what we need in that position. You can often look at organizations. There are people in this world who are outstanding transformational leaders that can take a company and an organization from its current state to some future state. And then once they've achieved that future state, they will leave that company and allow another leader, another CEO or president of the company to come in and maintain the status quo and move that company along. but their expertise really lies in the ability to transform. And so they're constantly looking for opportunities to do that in companies. And then that's why we talk about it situation specific. What have they done in the past, and what's best suited to their leadership style? Every organization needs to plan for a change in leadership, because an organization that fails to grow and evolve over time is an organization that eventually dies out. My old boss, and I probably told you this story before, back during the horse-drawn carriage days, the company that was doing manufacturing buggy whips was doing a fantastic business until the first car rolled off the assembly line. And they failed to see the vision of what needed to happen in the future and failed to evolve the company. So failure in a company goes to not being able to recognize what is occurring today and how that's going to impact the future state of the organization. All right, so from training leaders' perspective, we need to make sure that we constantly look at training and evaluation. Training from a leadership perspective or training from a technical perspective is easy. We can get somebody to do that. We can teach them how to do specific things. But leadership training has to be done by somebody who's more self-conscious and self-motivating and self-monitoring, that they have a desire to be in a leadership role. To go back to somebody's question earlier about, or somebody's comment about not being able to lead specific people. Well, there are also people that are not cut out to be leaders. It's just not in their wheelhouse, not in their skill set, or it's not something that they have a desire to do. So we could teach them how to implement things. We could teach people how to do specific things, but they have to be engaged and motivated to be a leader. We also have to teach the concept of trust and mentoring and how to analyze specific situations and make decisions based on all of the data that's associated with that situation, not just the transactional data on if I do this, this occurs, for instance, in a manufacturing scenario or something like that, but what's the impact on the people? How are the people going to perceive that? What's their propensity for taking on such risk? How much do they trust the organization? All of these things go into our understanding behavioral attitudes, actions of the organizations, and how they respond. I apologize, my throat's dry. I don't have COVID-19. All right, and then we also have to review leadership and their actions after we have organizational events. There should be a review of what's occurring across the globe today and how leaders have responded to the COVID-19 crisis. Not just political leaders. What about the leaders of the companies? What about leaders in individual towns and counties? And how about unofficial leaders, people in your neighborhoods who have stood up and doing specific things and checking on other people? What's been our response and what can we learn from that? Things like you said, I heard this morning on the news where some companies and grocery stores are evolving and opening up early hours or just the first hour or two in the morning for their grocery store to allow the elderly to come in and do shopping without being inundated with all these people who are fighting and pushing and shoving, to help protect them and their health risk and even their mental and emotional ability to deal with a scenario like this. So it's key to make sure that we look at not just reviewing, but out of that review, start to think about what are the things that we can learn from it, and how do we train transformational leaderships to look to the future and to think about how things are going to occur, and think about our actions today, how they impact people tomorrow, and what the outcome of that is. So when we think about matching leadership, we have to look at their effectiveness and look at the situation, look at the structure, how distributed is the organization, how many layers, where do we need specific types of leadership and transactional, transformational, and how enthusiastic are they, and where do we need to put those? We need to focus on hiring people that are in that upper right quadrant of that chart that I showed you, and think about transformational leadership that gets people more involved. And why is that important? So transformational leadership is important because we're actually developing the leadership and decision-making skills of the people below us. And they eventually grow into and move into those leadership roles moving forward. So transformational leadership does a lot more in the way of developing future leaders than transactional leadership does. In the hiring process, we have to hire people who we think are ethical and trustworthy. And we look at what they've done in the past. We look at decisions they've made in the past. We can look at the interview process and different testing scenarios and how we would get to what they think, not just what they can put on paper, but how their mind works and how they make decisions, and whether or not they include the impact of people in that decision-making process. And then lastly, we need to make sure that we develop this trust model with employees, and think about how we strengthen that bond between employees and leaders, and how we invest in that as we're moving along, and get people to look at scenarios that will develop their own skills, but also allow them to develop their relationship ability, not just from a decision-making process, but from a human behavior process as they move through in the organization. All right, so so that's the end of today's lecture, and I see we're at 13 minutes after the hour. Any questions so far about what we've talked about today in terms of leadership and skills? I'll wait for a second. So I know this is going to be difficult. I know it's a little bit, appreciate that, Josh. I know it's a little bit disjointed or asynchronous, even in a synchronous environment, as we're kind of doing it real time. But I wanted to make sure that as we move through this, we're probably at least going to be doing this for the next few weeks, possibly even till the end of the semester. So be prepared for that. And again, make sure that you're setting aside the time, setting aside the location. Get in, be ready to participate, ask your questions, and engage. So I appreciate you all taking the time. I look forward to seeing your work this week, and I hope you all stay safe. Make sure you wash your hands, check in on the elderly, your grandparents, your parents, friends of yours, and make sure you're just following the rules and regulations that are laid out, and we'll all get through this together. So if there are no other questions, that's the end of today's lecture. I'll hang out for a few minutes in case anybody has a question and they want to send me a chat. Otherwise, I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.